Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.
Well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. Really glad you're with us here tonight. Tonight, we're going to continue our Patriot series that we're doing as part of the 250th anniversary of the United States, which is in 2026, which we're very excited about. We've already come out with a couple of episodes this year already around the Patriot series. And tonight, we're going to talk about two additional Patriots. One of them not born in the United States, and that was John Paul Jones. He's the first non-American born Patriot that we're going to talk about in this series. He was born in Scotland and came over in very interesting circumstances, and we'll get into all those different details. But essentially, he grew up hating the British, as many Scots did, and came over very patriotic, wanting a new life, coming to Virginia, signing up for the American Navy, which really didn't exist at the time. It was just a couple of ships and couldn't come anywhere close to matching what the British had on the open seas. And he helped that Navy put together a growth plan and design new ships and design much more lethality, so that as the Americans got their sea legs during the Revolution itself, he was able to commandeer and command the American Navy as it grew and as it became a really important fighting force during the Revolution. We'll get into all the details of why John Paul Jones, the Scot, came over and joined the American Revolution, became a patriot, and how he became the father of the American Navy. The other one we're going to talk about tonight, who is also a great patriot, was in the Civil War era, and he fought for the Union against the Confederates. His name was Emory Upton, and he is probably someone you have never heard of unless you are a historian or someone who really knows Civil War history. Emory Upton was born in New York, joined up in the effort against the Confederates for many different reasons. One of the major ones is he wanted adventure. But more importantly, he was an abolitionist, and he believed very strongly slavery should be abolished and ended in the colonies and in the country. And he felt like it was the obligation of the new United States to take a moral stand against slavery. And so he signed up for the Union Army and became a really important officer in those corps. And we'll talk about some of the things he did while he was in the military. Became a very decorated individual in that military, working all the way under the right hand of Grant towards the very end of the war. But what Emory Upton did as the father of the American Army, or the modern American Army, in a lot of ways, what he did was more important after his military career was over. He did a series of writings during his 16 years as an instructor, both at West Point and several other institutions. And those writings he did studied warfare that we had done in the Americas, some of the things we had done well, some of the things we had not done well as part of the Civil War and otherwise. And he also looked at some of the other countries in Europe and Asia that had gone through wars at the time, including Prussia, which of course is Germany, and a couple of the Asian conflicts. And he looked at them and he broke down what he thought those armies did well and what he thought those armies didn't do well. And he wrote several very large treatises that became the backbone of how the United States Army is run today. And that's why he is called the father of the modern American Army. So tonight we'll talk about the father of the American Navy and the father of the American Army in this Patriot series. We have a lot of really good information for you. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so this is John Paul Jones and Emory Upton, fathers of the American Navy and Army. You'll see to the left there is a picture of John Paul Jones under the "Don't Tread on Me" flag. That's actually the flag that the Continental Army at the time in the Revolution used to fly on its ships when it was going up against the British in the open seas. Again, when he took over and joined that naval force, they essentially had 4 ships up against the British, who had over 250 ships. So you can imagine the Americans were very much outnumbered and really didn't have a chance on the open seas until John Paul Jones put his weight behind growing the Navy and making it a fighting force. Just to the right of that is a picture of John Paul Jones several years later, after he's gotten the Navy fully put together, and grown and built a lot of different ships in the fleet. And they became a real fighting force under his discipline and under his training. So one of the reasons he is called the father of the Navy is because of what he did for the Continental Army. To the right of that, you see to the far right, is a picture of Emory Upton. That's him in his Union gear when he was fighting for the Union Army in the Civil War on behalf of the United States. And just to the left of that is one of the major battles he led. And he actually tried out several different new strategic tactics on the battlefield. And these are tactics that had never been really tried before, but were very successful, and so successful that Grant ended up taking Emory Upton's tactics and making them the standard tactics for the rest of the war, which of course were very successful on behalf of the Union to win the war. Just above Emory Upton there, you see the flag he used to operate under, which was the flag of the U.S. Army at the time. And he had many different roles, as we'll go through in a minute, that he did in the Army himself as he continued to get promoted throughout the war. So John Paul Jones, the father of the American Navy, was born in 1747, died in 1792. He was a British-American naval officer who served in the Continental Navy during the American Revolutionary War. He was often referred to as the father of the American Navy, and we talked about why. He joined a ragtag group of ships and men that didn't really know what they were doing. And he's regarded by several commentators as one of the greatest naval commanders in the military history of the United States, and that includes all eras. He really was that good on the open seas. He was born John Paul, without Jones at the time, just John Paul, on July 6, 1747, in Kirkcudbright, Scotland. And at the age of 13, after some schooling, he entered the British Merchant Marines and went to sea for the first time as a cabin boy. He became first mate on a slavery brigantine in 1766, but soon left that trade in disgust, feeling that it was unjust to enslave people. So he really didn't like the slave trade, although he did try it for a while as a first mate. He was appointed master in 1769 on a new ship, and in 1773, after 4 years as master, he killed the leader of his mutinous crew in self-defense in Tobago in the West Indies. It was a really interesting incident that happened there. He claimed self-defense, and several of his men said it was true that he was being attacked and that he had to defend himself. And there were still others on the ship at the time that actually accused him of murder. To avoid trial, he fled to Virginia and was considered a fugitive by the British, who were trying to try him at the time for murder. He concealed his identity by adding the surname Jones to the end of his name. So he went from John Paul to John Paul Jones. He hated the British from a young age as a Scot and felt their heavy-handed practices were unjust. So you can see there was already the foundation as a young boy where he really despised the British. And now he really despised them even more because they kept several times trying to try him for different crimes throughout his life, especially this crime that happened on his ship where he was defending himself, he says. In terms of John Paul Jones' early life, born John Paul in Scotland on July 6, 1747, the future naval hero was the son of a gardener. Born at Abergland Estate in Scotland, he was the son of John Paul Sr. and Jean Duff. He was the fourth child of 7 and was one of only 5 who made it to adulthood. John did have an education as a young boy, but being sent to Kirkbean School in Scotland. However, he spent much of his time off at the nearby port in Carlistorn. Whenever he could, he ran down to the port where he would talk to sailors and clamber all over the ships and climb around. And it was clear that as a young boy, the sea was calling him. That was his calling as a person. He really felt like that's where he should be. At the age of 13, he signed on and began an apprenticeship for John Younger, a Scottish merchant shipper. His first voyage as a ship's boy took him to the Americas, sailing to Barbados and then to Virginia, where he stayed with his older brother William, who had emigrated to Virginia earlier, and strived as a tailor to sailors in Norfolk. So how interesting that one of his older brothers had already left and gone to the Americas, and settled in Virginia as a tailor. After returning to Whitehaven, Great Britain, John Paul had found that John Younger's business was failing, and he was released from his apprenticeship and employment. Now 17, which was 4 years later, John Paul entered the slave trade. Within 2 years, he transferred as first mate to the ship Two Friends of Kingston in Jamaica in 1766. The ship was only 50 feet long, and after several voyages to and from Africa, John quit the slave trade in disgust, calling it an abominable trade and looking for passage to Scotland. During the voyage, both the captain and the first mate died of fever. John Paul was the only man on the ship qualified to bring the ship named John home safely to Scotland. The owners of the ship were so pleased that they appointed him master and supercargo of the ship. So you can see he was, as a young man and a young boy, really rising through the ranks when it came to commanding a ship, and he really was getting a lot of experience on the open seas. So John Paul Jones, his emigration to America. Now at the age of 21, John Paul had become a captain. He adopted the manner of a young gentleman who was always neatly dressed and had an eye for the ladies, but came with a violent temper. While captaining the John, he was accused by the ship's carpenter of excessive flogging. The carpenter was examined and his complaint was dismissed. While returning to Scotland, that same carpenter died of yellow fever, and John was arrested and charged with murder. Evidence and a declaration from the master of the Barcelona packet was sufficient to acquit John, so he was released and made him a free man. The story will continue to follow him, however, throughout his entire life. In the years prior to the American Revolution, John Paul took command of the Betsy in the fall of 1772. Trading back and forth between England and the West Indies, he accumulated a considerable sum of money. So this was the time in his life doing this trading activity back and forth that he actually was becoming quite wealthy. The flourishment all came to a halt in 1773. John killed the ringleader of a mutiny with his sword aboard his ship in a dispute over wages. The man was a local of the West Indies. Feeling was against John, and to evade trial by the British lords, he fled to Virginia. Here he changed his name to John Paul Jones so he would not be tracked down by the British. So what an interesting reason of why he came to America. He essentially was enjoying himself as a captain, but eventually had to come because he was evading the British lords who were trying to try him again. John Paul Jones joins the Revolution. So while in Virginia, Jones' sympathies were with the colonists and the rebel cause for independence from Britain in the American Revolution. When Congress formed the Continental Navy, Jones rushed to Philadelphia to offer his services and was commissioned as the first lieutenant in December 1775. At the time, the Continental Navy consisted of a handful of ships. Jones was lieutenant of the Alfred and then later captain of the Providence. His exploits took him to the West Indies, where he distinguished himself against the British ship Glasgow. So that was his first major battle on the open seas, and he won the battle against a much more experienced captain. In 1776, he switched commands between the Alfred and the Providence as he operated in the Atlantic Ocean. He captured 8 prizes in British warships. He sunk and burnt another 8, and then towed several to port, those prizes, by the end of that year. So he had an incredible record in 1 year, where he had 8 prizes and several sunk. In June 1777, Jones was appointed to the newly built Ranger, which was a much more sophisticated designed ship. Sailing to the British Isles, he took several prizes before arriving in Brest, France in May of 1778, where he was hailed as a hero among the colonies. Operating out of Brest, Jones led a cruise to the Irish Sea, and he captured or destroyed small vessels along the way. This cruise made Jones a household name in Britain, where he was feared as the most effective sea captain in the world. So you can see he had become incredibly famous in the colonies as this very effective captain who was taking on the British and sinking and capturing many different ships. bringing them back to the colonies. And then, as you can see, he did this one voyage out of Brest, France, where he did the same for several small ships in the Irish Sea. And now he had gained a reputation all over Europe as well. It's really interesting that his fame was starting to really grow. So John Paul Jones, his impact on the American Navy, he's often called the father of the American Navy, as we mentioned. He was critical to the Continental Navy's success during the Revolutionary War by bringing the fight to the British home waters and establishing a reputation for fearless, aggressive leadership. His iconic victory aboard the Bonhomme Richard against HMS Serapis, which was one of Britain's best ships at the time. This battle happened in 1779 in the Battle of Flamborough Head, and it demonstrated American naval courage, while his daring raids on British coasts boosted American morale. "I have not yet begun to fight," was his very famous quote, following the capture of the British ship Serapis. The famous declaration cemented his reputation for unparalleled determination in the Americas and all over Europe. So he became very admired, as you can see. John Paul Jones joined and then led the American Navy from the point of being a ragtag small group of ships to helping it grow to a large force within several years of joining the American Revolution. Consulting with Congress, Jones helped design new warships to his detailed specifications. Jones established discipline and training and tactics, which would prove to be decisive on the open waters in the Atlantic and Caribbean. British admirals wrote journals at the time, remarking John Paul Jones' ability to lead a group of ships quickly into good positions to battle a much larger force and still come out victorious. So the British admirals were really admiring what he was doing and were amazed by his success. You can see a great picture there to the right of John Paul Jones tipping his hat in one of the battles that he won again. And you can see this sinking British ship in the background, one of his many successes. So let's talk about Emory Upton, the father of the modern American Army. See some great pictures there to the right of what he looked like as a Union soldier in the Civil War. Emory Upton, born August 27th, 1839, and died March 15th, 1881, was a United States Army general and military strategist, and he was prominent for his role in leading the infantry to attack entrenched positions successfully at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse during the American Civil War. But he also excelled at artillery and cavalry assignments. So what was amazing about him, not only was he a strategist and a tactician, and maybe one of the best we've ever had, but he could lead the infantry, he could lead the artillery, and he could lead the cavalry. So 3 different units within the Army. His work, The Military Policy of the United States, which analyzed American military policies and practices and presented the first systematic examination of the nation's military history. This work had tremendous effect on the U.S. Army when it was published posthumously in 1904. So this happened after his death, but it was a humongous impact on the military. This work had a huge impact on the way the Army was organized, trained, deployed, and the way strategies were constructed prior to battles. The writings are still studied at West Point and War College and in strategy sessions today, thereby leading to Upton being considered the father of the modern U.S. Army. It's really interesting that this individual who was so important back in the Civil War and came up through the ranks in the U.S. Army, and really his writings over the years became such a big foundation of what we do today. And yet most people have never heard of him unless you're a hardcore historian. Probably this is the first time you're hearing of Emory Upton. So Emory Upton, his early life, you can see a great picture there to the right of him as a very young cadet. Upton was born on a farm near Batavia, New York. He was the 10th child and 6th son of Danielle and Electra Randall Upton. He would become the brother-in-law of Andrew J. Alexander and of Frank P. Blair Jr. He studied under the famous evangelist Charles G. Finney at Oberlin College for 2 years before he was then admitted to the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1856. While he was at West Point, Upton lost a famous duel against a fellow cadet, Wade Hampton Gibbs of South Carolina. Gibbs made remarks to other cadets about Upton's relationships with African American girls at Oberlin College, which prompted Upton to challenge Gibbs to a duel. He really didn't like how Gibbs was talking to him. The two men fought with swords in a darkened room of the cadet barracks. Upton suffered a deep cut on his face. He graduated, however, 8th in his class out of 45 cadets on May 6, 1861, so he really was an excellent student. This was just in time for the outbreak of the Civil War. In 1868, Upton married Emily Norwood Martin, the daughter of philanthropist and social activist Cornelia Williams Martin, and yet his wife died of tuberculosis 2 years later in 1870. They had no children. So very sad that he finally found the woman he wanted to marry, and yet she only lasted 2 years and died of this terrible disease. You can see he really was an upstanding student and really had a very promising future. In terms of his military career, the newly commissioned Lieutenant Upton was assigned to the 5th Artillery Regiment in time to serve in the First Battle of Bull Run. During that battle, he was wounded but refused to leave the field, the first of many such instances in Upton's career where he refused to leave even when wounded. Upton commanded his battery during the Peninsula Campaign and was head of an artillery brigade in the 6th Corps during the Battle of Antietam. In October of 1862, Upton received a promotion to colonel of the 121st New York Infantry. In this position, he led the regiment through the battles of Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, where his regiment received its baptism by fire, and then eventually he also fought with his regiment in Gettysburg as well. He gained notoriety and he rose to brigade command along the way. So he was really effective as a commander, as you can see. Upton's most significant contribution did not come until Grant's Overland Campaign, which happened in May of 1864, which essentially, as we mentioned, he had come up with some really interesting tactics on the battlefield, and Grant took his advice and took those tactics and used them across the entire army and made him one of the commanding officers. For the next 15 years, Upton continued his military service after the war, most notably as the commandant of West Point from 1870 to 1875. That's a really important position. So he rose all the way to commandant of West Point. And you can see an incredible chart there to the right of all the different ranks that he was able to achieve in his Army career during all those years, pre-war, during the Civil War, and then after the war. And you can see what an incredible career he had. He had 11 different ranks all the way through, all the way up to general. Emory Upton's military strategy innovations. Facing the firmly entrenched Army of Northern Virginia, which were the Confederates, Upton petitioned his superiors to lead a brigade against the enemy's fortifications. The young colonel believed that swiftly advancing in a narrow, compact formation without halting to fire would greatly enhance the assault's probability of success and be able to get over the walls to battle against the Confederates. Though this approach was contrary to the tactics then in use during the war, his superiors trusted his judgment. On May 10, 1864, Upton led a small force against the Mule Shoe salient, which is now called the Bloody Angle, at Spotsylvania Courthouse. This was the first time this tactic had been used. Though Upton's charge lacked sufficient support to be decisive, the initial success of his tactic inspired Ulysses S. Grant to implement it in an assault 2 days later, this time with General Winfred S. Hancock's entire corps, which had huge and decisive success. Similar tactics would later be used against trenches in the First World War. This bravery and ingenuity earned Upton a much anticipated promotion to brigadier general. After recovering from a wound received at Spotsylvania, General Upton returned to action in the initial phases of the siege of Petersburg and in the 1864 Shenandoah Valley campaign. At the Third Battle of Winchester, Upton, then commanding a division in the 6th Corps, was again wounded and again refused to relinquish command, choosing instead to direct his troops from a stretcher. The convalescing Upton was promoted to Major General and asked to participate in General James H. Wilson's cavalry in a raid through Alabama and Georgia. Accepting this offer, Upton became one of the few officers to effectively lead troops in all three branches of the Army: artillery, infantry, and cavalry. So you can see he really rose very quickly. He was very innovative in his tactics, and he was coming up with all kinds of new ways to break the lines of the troops that you're facing, your enemies, and was recognized as such. And some of the tactics they were using were working so well that they essentially adopted them across the entire Union Army. You see a picture there to the right of what the Spotsylvania courthouse looked like when he and his men went right up the middle and busted over the barricades and essentially broke the lines of the Confederates and won that battle. So Emory Upton, his key writings. During his post-military career, he wrote A New System of Infantry Tactics. He wrote The Armies of Asia and Europe, and he also wrote The Military Policy of the United States from 1775. These and other writings that he did in his post-military career, he used drawn from his experiences in the Civil War, as well as his own personal observations of foreign military practices. He advocated dramatic changes in the American armed forces, and especially the Army, including advanced military education and improved promotion protocols. Upton's works were widely read in military circles and were later published by Secretary of War Elio Root. Impressed with the lessons of the Franco-Prussian War that he had studied, U.S. Army Commanding General William T. Sherman sent Upton on a tour of Europe and Asia to study military organizations, but with a special emphasis on the German army and how they were successful in the Franco-Prussian War. Upon his return, Upton wrote The Armies of Europe and Asia, which warned that European armies had developed soldiering as a profession, a full-time profession, to a more advanced state than the U.S. Army had. So essentially, he was criticizing the way the U.S. did business in having people in the Army be part-time and not be professional soldiers. Upton presented 54 pages of recommendations for changes in the Army to establish advanced military schools, a general staff, a system of personal evaluation reports, and promotion by examination. He was appointed superintendent of theoretical instruction at the Artillery School of Practice located at Fort Monroe, Virginia, where he emphasized combined arms tactics. His duties include teaching military art and science, geography, military history, and law. All of these items were introduced in 1875 by George W. Getty with Upton's advice and consent. In the last years of his life, Emory Upton suffered from severe headaches, quite possibly migraines associated with a brain tumor, although we'll never know. On March 15, 1881, while commanding 4th Artillery in Presidio, California, he wrote out his resignation from the Army and then promptly took his own life. He couldn't stand the pain any longer. Upton is now buried at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn, New York. So what an incredible career Emory Upton had, both pre the war, during the war as a officer rising all the way up to general. And then, as you see, he had a very substantial post-military career as well, and really shaped the Army in his image, which is why he's called the father of the modern U.S. Army. In terms of his impact on the U.S. Army, his work had a profound influence on discussions of military and civilian strategy for years and even today. All of Upton's proposed reforms would be implemented in the 1890s and early 1900s and laid the foundation for the high level of efficiency the U.S. Army demonstrated in World War I and World War II. His reforms and recommendations for improvement have been the basis for the modern U.S. Army to become the world's most efficient fighting force. Upton considered many of the successes and failures in the American Civil War and in multiple conflicts in Europe and Asia to assemble his many recommendations for military and Army reform. What Upton sought was nothing less than a revolutionary transformation of how America regarded and maintained its Army, beginning with the very first of his own 24 great principles that he put in his book. The overarching cause Upton championed in his general principles was the creation of a large, standing professional army for the first time in the United States history. And it was a cause he aggressively supported for the remainder of his life. In times of war, the government could quickly mobilize an effective, coordinated fighting force. In times of peace, the standing professional army, headed by general staff, ran advanced war colleges, plotted strategy, reviewed tactics, and evaluated officers and men. So you can see everything he wrote in his major works, especially the three major works that were published, have all been adopted, and we're still studying even today to make our military better. So what a revolutionary way that he put together these recommendations that have impacted the military overall and the U.S. Army specifically. Let's look at some John Paul Jones and Emory Upton quotes that were famous from back then. First one from John Paul Jones: "I have not yet begun to fight." His most important and famous quote that he did on the day that he was battling multiple British ships, and it looked very dire for him and his crew, but eventually they came out on top. "Nothing exciting ever happens to me," says John Paul Jones. This was in one of his letters talking about sitting around waiting for action. He really was one of those admirals who was out on the sea, but he really was a soldier at heart. He thought about all the time getting into action and fighting the British. And so this was him bemoaning the fact that it had been a long time since they had had action. "I wish to have no connection with any ship that does not sail fast, for I intend to go in harm's way," said John Paul Jones. So again, you see he very much was itching for a fight at all times with the British. He always wanted to be in the action, and he was ready to go, and he wanted to be on a ship that was fast and flexible. "A navy is essentially and necessarily aristocratic, true as may be the political principles for which we are now contending. They can never be practically applied or even admitted on board ship, out of port or off soundings. This may seem a hardship, but is nevertheless the simplest of truths. While the ships sent forth of Congress may and must fight for the principles of human rights and republican freedom, the ships themselves must be ruled and commanded at sea under a system of absolute despotism." So you can see he really believed in the ideals of fighting for the Americans off ship. But when he was on the ship, he was going to do whatever it took to be successful. So he really was very aggressive in his tactics. "As honorable peace is and always was my first wish, I can take no delight in the effusion of human blood. But if this war should continue, I wish to have the most active part in it." So that's John Paul Jones again saying that we want to win the war, we want peace, but as long as the war is underway, I want to be right in the middle of it. So this one's from Emory Upton: "Never believe what they say, they always lie. I have a saying, whatever they say, do the opposite, and you'll never go wrong." And that's really how Upton really believed. He believed, he was very kind of anti-government in his thinking, and he was very much for the military, for the Army in general. And he wanted them to always be skeptical about what the government was trying to say, but listen to your chain of command, of course. This was also from Emory Upton: I have heard of the dead lying in heaps, but never saw it till this battle. Whole ranks fell together." So he's really remarking there about how brutal war can be and some of the battles that he witnessed. As we mentioned, not just Spotsylvania Courthouse, but he was part of Gettysburg and he was part of Bull Run and a bunch of others, and was talking about how bad the casualties were. "I'm not a rubber stamp, and people know that. If you can convince me of the merits, you will have my vote every time." And he was talking about here, this was a quote just after he became a general in the Union Army, and how he talked about how he's not just going to accept your first explanation, but he wanted you to convince him of the merits of your argument or the merits of your strategy. So he really was a thinking man's general. "The obvious fact here, at least it was obvious to Upton, was that an assaulting column's only hope was to get a solid mass of riflemen right on the parapet as quickly as possible. So Upton formed his men in 4 lines, 3 regiments side by side in each line. So again, just going to how important these different tactics he came up with were. If you think about the wars of the Revolution, the Civil War, you had big lines of men lining up against each other, face to face, only maybe 100 yards away, and all shooting away at each other. And there was no protection at all. You're basically just making yourself a huge target, just lining up that way. So he completely flipped that on its head, and he wanted there to be 3 or 4 columns total with 1 man at the front and lots of men behind them in straight lines, attacking the center of the defense to break it up and to essentially break the lines. This was a completely different way of doing war, more like a guerrilla type of war, and was incredibly successful at the end of the Civil War. Life is but an instant as compared with eternity, and where we reflect that our future condition depends upon our actions here in this world, it is but reasonable that we should bow before the Creator to acknowledge his supremacy. I ask his forgiveness for our manifold violations of his law. So interesting, he and, of course, many of his men were very religious and believed, of course, in the supremacy of God and their Creator. And he was essentially asking for forgiveness for some of the things they had to do on the battlefield to win. And essentially was acknowledging him as the supreme creator. For 3 years, Upton had been mulling over the problems rifling presented to the offensive. He saw this as his first opportunity to make an important reform in the field of tactics where the Army most needed improvement. Upton began to advocate an attack column mounted from close to enemy works. Many other junior officers in both armies had suggested tactical changes, since linear tactics were no longer satisfactory in the age of the Civil War. But Upton had 2 advantages. He had outlined the method of attack that was simple and traditional, and he was in a position to try that idea at once at Spotsylvania. Grant and Meade listened with interest and promised to give Upton an opportunity to test his method, which of course they did. So how interesting is that he earned their trust? He showed his mettle on the battlefield. He showed how good he was and what a leader of men he was. And he finally got the chance at Spotsylvania to try out this new tactic, which was going to be a situation where the men charging the parapets were not as big a target. And he was wildly successful. So that gives you a really good sense for John Paul Jones and Emory Upton, the father of the American Navy and the father of the American Army. And gives you a good sense for the Revolutionary War, which, of course, John Paul Jones played a huge part in on the open seas. And Emory Upton, the tactician, one of the better Union generals at the time, and he really fought hard and he rose up the ranks very quickly. And then in some ways, he created an even more huge advantage for the U.S. Army in his post-military career with all of his writings, all his discussions on tactics, since he was a thinking man's general. And even today, we're still dealing with both of these men and their legacies and the incredible contributions they made for the Army and the Navy. Let's go ahead and take a look at 2 short videos, and we'll come back and talk about those.
When the storm clouds of war gathered, the American colonies were in no position to fight the greatest land and naval power in the world, British Empire. The colonials had no navy, no standing army, just a collection of colonial militias that were not a traditional standardized force, and of course we had no Marine Corps. Foreign assistance to aid the colonies in their desire to be free came in many forms, such as foreign military officers like the Prussian Baron von Steuben, the French Marquis de Lafayette, and Polish Casimir Pulaski, and a Scottish fugitive from British justice, John Paul Jones. These foreigners helped create and train the American forces in the great struggle to come, but one would stand out. Who was John Paul Jones? Why was he critical to the colonial forces? What did he actually do to create what would become the United States Navy? What happened to him after the American Revolution? John Paul Jones was born John Paul on July 6, 1747, in Kirkcudbright, Scotland, under the name of John Paul, the Jones being added later. And coming from a very modest family with few prospects, he signed on into the British Merchant Marine and went to sea for the first time as a cabin boy at age 12. He spent many years at sea and learned all the skills required of an able seaman, and also became a master navigator, after which he became first mate on a brigantine slave ship collecting their human cargo off the coast of West Africa. Being personally appalled by the slave trade, he transferred to a merchantman in 1766 and was appointed a ship's master in 1769. His problems began when in 1773 he faced a mutiny aboard ship while anchored in Tobago. Depending upon the source and story, the leader of the mutiny attacked him with a bludgeon, and he killed the man in self-defense with either a pistol or sword. The British Admiralty took an interest and wanted a formal trial. The dead man apparently had powerful business friends in London. It was apparent that John Paul would probably not receive a fair trial, as the crew who mutinied would be called to testify. Others on the ship who supported his case as witnesses were removed from the ship and scattered to other ships so as to be unavailable as defense witnesses. John Paul saw what was coming, and that he would not receive a fair trial, so he fled to Virginia and was listed as a fugitive from justice by the British government, which was why he added the surname Jones. Jones had landed in the colonies at just the right time, as they were in the early stages of breaking away from Great Britain. As a wanted man, he fit right in with the rebellious colonial leadership, who were also considered criminals and traitors. In 1775, Jones arrived in Philadelphia and signed on to the Continental Navy, which was just in its birthing stage, and received his commission as a lieutenant on the first American flagship, the sloop Alfred. Jones was also very knowledgeable of the Royal Navy's tactics and methods. He met with the colonial leadership and laid out his vision as to what the Continental Navy needed to have a chance at winning the coming war. He told them that due to the time required and the great expense and resources required, they would need to build a frigate fleet. His argument was that the Americans would never be able to build the ships of the line, the battleships of their day, with between 74 and 100 guns or more. They could build 4 fast, well-armed frigates instead for the same cost as one ship of the line and in far shorter time. He also suggested that the Americans adopt a seagoing fighting force, such as the British had with their Royal Marines, who maintained a discipline and order on their warships and also operated as an amphibious landing force. An American officer, Samuel Nichols, was also of the same mindset, and following the meeting with Jones, the Continental Congress commissioned Nichols to raise 2 battalions of seafaring warriors, in essence, creating a corps of Marines. In a place called Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, on November 10, 1775, Samuel Nichols appointed Robert Mullen, who owned Tun Tavern, as the first U.S. Marine recruiter, while Nichols interviewed the prospects and vetted their qualifications. Jones's argument was taken seriously. He had his Marines and was instrumental in the building of the heavily armed frigates. Along with his experience and powers of persuasion, Jones was quickly promoted to captain in 1776 and given command of the lightly gunned but very fast sloop USS Providence. His bravery and willingness to take great risks were duly noted, and his advice was often sought. By the end of October, Congress authorized the purchase of outfitting 4 armed vessels. On December 3, the USS Alfred, USS Andrew, USS Doria, USS Cabot, and USS Columbus, and later the USS Providence, USS Wasp, and USS Alliance joined the small fleet. Some of these ships were refitted merchantmen. On December 22, 1775, Admiral Essex Hopkins was appointed the naval commander-in-chief, and officers of the Navy were commissioned. John Paul Jones was one of the first commissioned fleet officers serving under him. In March 1776, this small fleet, complemented by the Providence and Wasp, Hopkins led the first major naval action of the Continental Navy against Nassau, Bahamas, where stores of much-needed gunpowder were seized, for the use of the Continental Army and Navy. On April 6, 1776, the squadron, including USS Fly, unsuccessfully encountered the 20-gun HMS Glasgow in the first major sea battle of the Continental Navy, where Marine sharpshooters were stationed in the fighting tops of the ship's masts and targeting enemy officers, naval gunners, and helmsmen. Jones's plan was for the Marines to conduct 2 amphibious landings in Nassau, in the Bahamas, to seize naval stores from the British, with the first landing led by Captain Nichols, with 250 Marines and sailors who landed in New Providence, in the Bahamas, destroying installations and capturing gunpowder and food supplies. The second landing, led by Lieutenant Trevette, landed at night and captured several ships at anchor along with the supplies. Congress then authorized the addition of 13 frigates to be specifically constructed as warships rather than refitting merchantmen. While on his first cruise aboard USS Providence, Jones's seamanship saw his crew destroy British fisheries in Nova Scotia and capture 16 ships as prizes, which were later reflagged as American vessels and put to good use. On November 2, 1777, Jones was in command of the newly built USS Ranger with a crew of 140 men. They departed from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, headed to the naval port at Brest, France. Bringing the USS Ranger into port in France, the American ship was saluted by the French Admiral La Motte Piquet, making USS Ranger the first American vessel ever to be recognized by a foreign power. After reprovisioning with food and water, they sailed into the Irish Sea and began raiding on British targets. Targeting merchantmen and fishing vessels, he hoped to damage their economy. During 1777 and 1778, Ranger operated in British home waters, and Jones, with his Marines, led daring raids on English and Scottish shore installations, destroying buildings and capturing powder and shot. The Continental Congress was impressed with his audacity and success, and in recognition of these successes, he was placed at overall command of 5 French and American vessels. The French had refitted an East India merchant ship launched in 1766, the Duc de Duras, into a new frigate, the Bonhomme Richard, or Goodman Richard, named after Benjamin Franklin's pamphlet character in his Poor Richard's Almanac, and Jones always carried a copy with him. Jones led his small squadron on his new flagship, Bonhomme Richard, formally named, and they succeeded into the capture of 7 merchantmen off the Scottish coast. On September 23, 1779, Jones and his ship fought one of the bloodiest engagements in U.S. naval history with the 44-gun Navy frigate Serapis. The HMS Serapis was a Royal Navy 2-decked Roebuck-class fifth-rate, or frigate, commanded by Captain Richard Pearson. She was a new ship launched in early 1779 and, at that time, was armed with 50 guns. The Bonhomme Richard, with 380 officers and enlisted sailors and Marines, mounted 42 guns, and being an older ship, was vulnerable to below-the-waterline cannonball penetration. Jones's aggressive action almost ended in disaster, and after exchanging broadsides, with his own vessel burning and sinking, Captain Pearson of Serapis, seeing the sinking American ship, requested that Jones surrender, but Jones did not accept the British demand, replying, "I have not yet begun to fight." Jones then crashed his ship into the Serapis, and his crew tied the 2 ships together as his Marines threw themselves onto the larger British ship's deck. 3 hours later, after severe hand-to-hand combat with the American Marines sweeping the deck with musket fire and leading a boarding party, the Serapis surrendered, and Jones took control and transferred his flag. When the Bonhomme Richard sank, Jones took command of Serapis. This engagement made headlines on both continents, and it was one of the factors following the American victory at Saratoga 2 years earlier that convinced France to get heavily involved with assisting the colonies against their mutual enemy. He was praised by the Americans and the French, while the British, learning who he was, wrote about him as a pirate, a bloody butcher, and a common criminal, and they compared him to Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, and put a price on his head. The writings about him from his contemporaries, such as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, described him as well-dressed, carried a sword, and conducted himself with practiced decorum. He had a Scottish brogue and a light Celtic feature. He was intense about his honor and his duties, and was a harsh military master, but was also surprisingly sociable. Thomas Jefferson was an admirer and thought good of him after their meeting, and others referred to him as Little Jones, as he stood 5 feet 5 inches tall, and he was a prolific poem and letter writer, spoke some French, and, though he never married, was involved in many romances. Jones found that after the United States won its independence, there was a lot of political infighting, and there was probably a lot of personal jealousy against him, so he moved on to other efforts. In 1788, Russian Empress Catherine the Great wanted to increase Russia's naval capabilities and appointed Jones as a rear admiral, in which he saw action in the Liman campaign in the Black Sea against the Turks. Following his duty for Russia in 1789, he moved to Paris and was appointed as the U.S. consul to Algiers, but he died before the commission arrived. His body was buried in Paris. In 1905, after a lengthy search, his grave was discovered and removed from the gravesite in Paris and brought to the United States due to the efforts of President Theodore Roosevelt. John Paul Jones's remains were reinterred in an ornate tomb at the Naval Academy Chapel at Annapolis, Maryland in 1913. In his honor, commissioned in 1991, the USS John Paul Jones DDG-53 is the latest destroyer named in honor of Jones. 3 previous ships were also named after him. Other ships named after John Paul Jones were the Paul Jones, a sidewheel steam gunboat, the Paul Jones DD-10, the Paul Jones DD-230, the John Paul Jones DD-932, and John Paul Jones DDG-53. John Paul Jones is regarded as the father of the United States Navy and was a catalyst for the creation of the United States Marine Corps. He helped us secure our freedom from Great Britain, and his legend is secure.
There exists an unfortunate league of men and women who suffer the distinct injustice that their accomplishments and contributions, no matter how far-reaching nor significant, despite all visibility and impact, even in the current day, might be all but forgotten. Consigned to the back pages and dusty library shelves of history. One member of said league is considered by many the father of the modern U.S. Army, and his name is Major General Emory Upton. Not born into any distinction or wealth, Upton would provide his own distinction. Fascinated by the military, after reading about the life of Napoleon, he would eventually enroll in the U.S. Military Academy at West Point by age 16 and graduate 8th in his class of 45. Immediately, he found himself in the service of his country, aiming the first gun at the First Battle of Bull Run as a first lieutenant. It was the beginning of a long, valiant, and successful career. Unlike so many soldiers who are simply content to survive another day with victories as a desirable bonus, Upton's mind was constantly churning, analyzing. Every battle was an opportunity to learn new tactics, to try a new approach in combat, or to cast aside many of the military doctrines he had studied so fervently. Instead of long, slow rows of troops, he utilized quick-moving columns. He used horses to move troops, who then would dismount and fight as infantry. They used Spencer carbines. They set the Confederacy ablaze. Even before mustering out in 1866, Upton was lauded by his superiors for his bravery, his tenacity, professionalism, ingenuity, and improvisation. Thrown in the crucible of the Civil War, he emerged an extremely influential mind and strategist, and at just 25 years of age. After he finished his service with numerous brevet promotions, Upton returned to his alma mater and by 1867 published a book largely based on his experiences in the Civil War. The new book was titled A New System of Infantry Tactics, and indeed it was. Just as on the battlefield, Upton condemned the outdated tactics of forming wide lines and firing volleys. Technology had advanced, and Upton reasoned that fighting should advance with it. His new tactics would rely heavily on skirmishers over well-formed lines, individual responsibility over tightly controlled soldiers, and of course, the ability to improvise. If you think that sounds a lot like the current-day Marine Corps' improvise, adapt, and overcome, you're not alone. Ulysses S. Grant saw the merit of Upton's system, and by August that same year, the first ever general of the Army of the United States ordered all Army and all militias to adopt Upton's new tactics. The next year, 1868, Upton was married to Emily Martin, but the marriage was tragically short. During their European honeymoon, she contracted a lung infection and diminished gradually in health until her untimely death in 1870 at the age of 25. The couple had borne no children. Now, Upton took his grief and transformed it into productivity. Just 30 years old, he worked with a fervor seldom seen. He dedicated himself to the cadets at West Point, as well as bolstering his already published infantry tactics to include his experiences and discoveries in the fields of artillery and cavalry. By 1875, he was sent to research the world's armies. His work ethic and dogged pace saw him visit Austria-Hungary, Britain, China, France, Germany, Italy, India, Japan, and Persia, and he still returned by the fall of 1876. Of course, he wasn't just traveling there. He was observing carefully their practices, their training, tactics, recruitment, equipment, hospitals, camps, barracks, pay, morale, anything that might help benefit the armies of the United States. His observations were bogglingly thorough, as was the 370-page book he finished just a year later entitled The Armies of Europe and Asia, the end of which included 54 pages of recommendations for the reorganization of the U.S. Army. His top call to action? A large, standing, professional army. By decreasing dependence on lesser-trained militias, and with the ability to react more quickly to potential conflicts, Upton hoped to eliminate, quote, the loss of life and treasure that occurred when the United States was caught off guard by the inevitable call to war. Despite receiving support by higher-ups in committees, the bill for his reform stalled in Congress. However, it would take more than a stubborn Congress to stop Upton. He immediately began composing a manifesto in response entitled Military Policy of the United States, sometimes writing as much as 9 hours a day during 1880. But his usual gusto was waning. He began to suffer frequent, debilitating headaches. Specialists were unable to help. The headaches continued, and his words and mental state began to suffer. He began to become erratic. He began to forget things. On March 14th, 1881, he wrote his sister stating that he hoped God would, quote, lead me to sacrifice myself rather than to perpetuate a method which might in the future cost a single man his life. He then wrote out a single sentence which resigned his commission, picked up a Colt 45 from his desk, placed it in his mouth, and pulled the trigger. He was 41 years old. Upton died a true and tragic hero who spent his life dedicated to saving the lives of American servicemen and who, self-aware of his waning lucidity, would rather sacrifice himself than to cause harm to future soldiers. Fortunately, his story does not end there. His final work remained unpublished for decades, circling among friends and contemporaries, but came to light again in 1904, courtesy of Teddy Roosevelt, Secretary of War Elihu Root. Not only did he have the manuscript published, but many of Upton's recommendations became part of what are now the famous route reforms. The War Department was reformed, West Point grew, the U.S. Army War College was started, and the General Staff was formed. Procedures for promotion were changed, as were the organization of the state militias and the National Guard. This among numerous other significant changes. Upton's unpublished book would become one of the most influential works by a U.S. Army officer and forever change the American military in the 20th century and beyond. His remarkable military mind, keen observations, his uncanny drive, his pursuit of excellence, and dedication to the American soldier allowed him to shape what became the most powerful military force on earth.
So a lot of interesting tidbits out of those two videos. The first one around John Paul Jones and Emory Upton. As you see, one was the father of the Navy, one was the father of the Army, but both of them had a very large impact on the Marines. The formation of the Marines, the recruiting of the Marines. In the case of John Paul Jones, actually putting those Marines on board his ships so that they could board both another ship and also as they ran aground and went to do raiding of gunpowder and other things, they could do the things that Marines do, which is to go aground and to go take a town or go take a village or go take a fort. So really interesting that the U.S. Marines also came out of the efforts of both of these men. Of course, Emory Upton, in terms of the Army, also a lot of his tactics were adopted by the Marines, and in some cases were more apt to be taken on by the Marines because they really are guerrilla type tactics, which is what the Marines are good at. So very interesting there. You can see in the video both men, incredible patriots. In the case of John Paul Jones, the man who was born in Scotland, the man who grew up to detest England, who was always trying to put him on trial, just wanted to be on the open seas, loved being a captain, and really did a tremendous service to America in helping us form our first Navy and then helping that Navy grow and be successful in the Revolutionary War. So I just can't say enough about the patriotism he showed, even though he was not born in this country, but his efforts on behalf of America should be rewarded and should be celebrated in this 250th year. In terms of Emory Upton, most of you might not have heard of him before. Now you know about him, the father of the modern American Army. Both of these men really should be looked at even deeper. You should dig into their histories, their past, their writings. Emory Upton, as you can see today, is having a large impact on the U.S. Army in general, but also on the Marines. And really his tactics are being studied in military universities and colleges all over the world, not just American. And his recommendations that he made to really reshape and reform and improve the American military in general really have carried through to today. And many of those things are instituted in the way that we do business in the U.S. military. So really fascinating, these two patriots, one in the Revolutionary War and one in the Civil War. And again, hopefully you enjoyed that, and you're going to want to dig into both of these gentlemen even further. Hopefully you enjoy history as much as we do. This is a special year with the 250th year of the United States. We'll continue to do this Patriot series. We have a lot more great episodes coming your way. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And we will see you next time on an episode of Traveling Through History. Have a good night.
Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.